fine pleasure to welcome all of you to these august heights, the 9th floor of the Repeat River building. We're at a very special place. I feel like I need oxygen up here. So thank you all for coming and finding the joint. And I think you'll be very happy that you do. We have a very special guest who has made the journey across the Charles River to Boston University in Cambridge. And that, of course, is Harvey Cox, renowned theologian and thinker. Harvey Cox has been a fixture at Harvard University, if I may use that undignified word, for many decades. He retired only last year from his position as the Hollis Professor at Harvard University. He's well known for a number of works, including Jesus Comes to Harvard, if I remember correctly, quite a famous book, The Secular City, which has sold even more copies than Robert Hefner's book. I think I've read that The Secular City has sold something like 1 million copies, which is quite something. And recently has just published a new book. In fact, I happen to have a copy, Future of Faith, which only came out, I believe, this year. From Harper and Harper and Row, or Harper One. In any case, a very interesting book, very much talking about the importance of communities based on faith as opposed to doctrine and structure of established churches, and very much continuing and sort of updating the arguments, some of the arguments that we encountered in the Secular City. Professor Cox is going to speak to us tonight about Islam and Muslims through Christian eyes. And I've asked, thankfully he's accepted, Robert Hefner, my colleague from the Anthropology Department, to offer some comments after the talk and remarks by Professor Cox. And then we'll have a chance for you in the audience to ask you the questions. We'll finish up by about 6:30. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Boston University Professor Harvey Cox.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. I don't know whether I like the word fixture. I have plumbing in mind, fixture, but I'm no longer that much of a fixture. May I take my jacket off?
Yes, please, thank you.
Okay. It is fun to come across the river and to have an audience that's interested in this topic. We hear a lot nowadays about Islam and sometimes about the relationships between Islam and Christianity. And in the last few years, this has become one of my major interests. One could say, in fact, that in the time that we are now living in, just like at the beginning of A Tale of Two Cities, it is the best of times and the worst of times. There's hardly ever been a time when there have been more conferences, journals, meetings, conversations, dialogues between Muslims and Christians here and there all around the world. And I've been to quite a few of them in the last few years. At the same time, unfortunately, some of the tensions between Christians and Muslims in various parts of the world have boiled up again, usually caused not by specifically religious, but more by politically motivated reasons, sometimes disguised or forwarded as religious reasons. So here we are, and I'm happy that there are people who want to talk about this. What I want to do is talk very briefly about a quick snapshot of the history that brought us to this point. From a Christian perspective, what have Christians made of Muslims? How have Christians tried to understand who Muslims were from the time of the Prophet up until the present? And I'm a little embarrassed because I have a student in the front row here, Mariam Sharif, who took a whole seminar-length course last year on this subject, so she knows it all. And I told her she could leave at any moment if it gets a little boring or repetitious for her. But now you're going to get the whole thing in 15 minutes. Think about that. Right after the life of the Prophet and the revelation of the Quran and the beginning of the expansion of Islam across Africa and into the Middle East, remember that the Middle East at that time was really largely a Christian empire. And therefore, the expansion of Islam was often at the expense, so to speak, of Christian empires across the top of Africa and in the Middle East. But Christians could not understand at first, maybe never have, who these people are. In part because there were categories in the early medieval theology of those centuries, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, that into which you had to fit in order to be understood from this Christian theological perspective. They knew, for example, there were pagans, most of them up in Northern Europe, where my forebears came from, who were still pagans at the time. There were Jews. They knew who they were and how they fit into the whole scheme of things. There were heretics, and we know what happened to heretics. And there were schismatics. Now it's very important to notice that they made a distinction between heretics and schismatics. Heretics were people who, in their mind, in the early medieval Christian mind, denied the essentials of Christianity and therefore really had to be eliminated, and were often eliminated in not particularly pretty ways. Schismatics were a little different. They were people who, although their theology seemed to be all right, with maybe a few deviations, did not submit themselves to the Bishop of Rome. Did not submit themselves to the Pope as the power of the papacy began to emerge, and therefore they were schismatics in that they were viewed as cutting off or cutting apart the whole Corpus Christianum. Now it was very, very important to decide whether somebody was a heretic or a schismatic. A schismatic you could deal with. In fact, there were sometimes rather good relations between the Roman Catholic Western Church and the schismatics, Nestorian Christians and other Christians. However, it was not a good thing to be a heretic. So when the whole debate emerged in the early medieval period about Muslims, whether they were heretics or schismatics or something else, was very important. Doesn't seem as important to us today, but still there it was. Now, the reason they were puzzled was Muslims didn't seem to fit into any of these categories. They weren't pagans. Look, they had a holy book. They had prayers. In that holy book, they mentioned the prophets, and they mentioned Jesus, and they mentioned Mary. They prayed. They gave alms. They weren't pagans. They certainly didn't worship idols. Decidedly not. And therefore, for some of the Christians in the early years of Islam, they were seen to be really a kind of a favorable force, because at least they got people to stop worshiping idols, although there were these other problems. So what were they? And again, to say, it may not seem particularly crucial to us, but it's good to know that that was a discussion back in those early days. By the way, one of the early ways in which Muslims were understood, especially as Muslims moved up from what is now Morocco into southern Spain, into Andalus. By the way, they came up allied with Christian princes against other princes. This was not just a Muslim invasion of Spain, it was a coalition. Nonetheless, some of the Christian princes there, or the clergy who were advising them, saw them as the scourge of God. The scourge of God against the infidelity and faithlessness of some of the people in that area. Now I remember when I read that and began reading something about these early discussions about who Muslims were. How can we think about them among medieval Christians? There's an awful lot of recycling that goes on. In the current discussion about often argument, sometimes completely ignorant and uninformed discussions about Islam among some Christians, there's a lot of recycling of old images, old stereotypes. In fact, very little new has been thought up. And rather, old images are exhumed and redeployed without even knowing that they're very old images. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of these images that keep coming back like a nasty song. There was the first effort which occurred in the medieval period to translate the Quran into Latin was, of course, not for the purpose of learning very much about Islam. Well, yes, learning about Islam, but learning about Islam so that the mission to the Muslims could be carried out more effectively. That was really the whole idea. It was an evangelistic and missionary device. Now, there were some people who were interested in it in a more scholarly and detached way. And as we know, that wonderful overlooked period from the time of the establishment of the Moorish government regime in Andalus, there were scholars, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars who worked around the same table, month after month and year after year, translating manuscripts, translating things from the Greek, bringing things from the Greek, from Greek and Arabic into Latin. They worked together very well. Nonetheless, the first project for translating the whole Quran was calculated to be a way of educating those who were going to be trying to convert Muslims. One of my favorite incidents, however, in the medieval period, this was in the 13th century, was St. Francis. St. Francis decided that he wanted to, he was against the Crusades. He thought they were unchristian and wrong, violent. He wanted to end them, and he decided that he wanted to go over and try to stop the crusade that was going on in Egypt at the time. So St. Francis, with just a little bit of chutzpah, you might say, selected 12 followers to go with him, and they went over to Aleppo, and he made an effort to see the Sultan, because he wanted to end the crusade. He pled with the general of the Christian armies, and he said, look, I don't think it's a very good idea for you to try to go through and see the Sultan. However, if you want to do it, do it. So St. Francis went up to the front line, went into no man's land, and was welcomed into the Sultan's camp. I'm told by some people that in Muslim belief, God favors children and idiots, protects children and idiots, and maybe they thought they had a case of both here. Also a holy man, viewed as a Christian holy man. So he had a conversation with the Sultan and tried to persuade him to stop his side of the fighting. But his way of doing that was to try to convince the Sultan to embrace Christianity. Well, the Sultan was willing to talk about peace, but not about that, not about conversion. So his mission did not succeed. Now, I'm jumping through history a little bit here, but I wanted to point out that something happened during the Crusades which had not been anticipated. And that is that a lot of the warriors from Europe who settled in what became the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Palestine, Kingdom of Jerusalem, got to know Muslims rather well. They even often adopted Arabic dress. They learned to speak the local language. And after a while were viewed by people back in Europe as having gotten a little too friendly with these people that you're supposed to be having a crusade against or a war with, a little bit too close. So some of these warriors were even tried for heresy, burned at the stake for their, even accusation was they'd become secret Muslims along the way. Nonetheless, these legends began to come up, began to appear, which appeared and reappeared and recycled in Europe a different kind of image of the Muslim. This time as a brave, honorable, courageous soldier with whom you could deal on a man-to-man basis. All the legends about Richard of the Lionheart meeting Saladin, and Saladin and the two respecting each other. Historically, Saladin never met Richard of the Lionheart, but these stories are wonderful anyway. And there was an incident apparently in which Saladin sent some iced juice into the camp when Richard had a fever. Nonetheless, that image persists as well. It comes out very strongly then in the Victorian period. See how I'm jumping along here. With the great novels, or at least the novels, whether they're great or not, of Sir Walter Raleigh. One of his key novels, immensely popular during his lifetime, during the Victorian period, was a novel called The Talisman, which features a French crusader who goes to the Holy Land and has an encounter with a Muslim warrior, and first they try to kill each other, then they get tired and they sit under a tree and have a conversation. It's a very long conversation. And they begin comparing, and talking back and forth. And the French crusader says to the Muslim, "Is it true that in your religion you're not allowed to drink alcohol?" And he said, "Oh yeah, that is true. We don't drink alcohol." "Is it true in your religion?" He says that you're only allowed to have one wife. And the crusader says, "Well, that's true. That's true." They were both kind of admitting that they were missing something along the line here. You get there a kind of a restatement, if you will, of some of the stereotypes that have emerged and that keep on re-emerging. By the way, I'm convinced that Winston Churchill, who was really reared in a kind of a Victorian atmosphere and kept a Victorian worldview throughout his life, had picked up on this kind of romantic image of Muslims. If you read what Churchill said about India, for example, Churchill was really down on Gandhi. He couldn't stand Gandhi. He despised him and really spent a lot of his career trying to oppose and destroy Gandhi. But he appreciated in India what he called the martial races. Not the Hindus, who he considered too feminized, but the Muslims, the Indian Muslims. This was why the British often recruited more Muslims than anybody else for their forces. A continuation of a stereotype of the brave, courageous, noble, and honorable warrior. Well, you may be glad to know that I'm coming now pretty close down to the present with this kind of hop, skip, and jump. The idea of Islam and Christianity and Judaism as being, as it were, sister faiths began to emerge in the late 19th century and was developed further in the 20th century, especially advocated by a number of Muslim scholars in the early part of the 20th century, pointing out that Abraham is the central figure, or the founding figure, in all three of these traditions. The Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Muslim tradition, very central in the Muslim tradition. And therefore the idea of the Abrahamic faiths began to take shape. And this has become, in recent years, a very, very important category to talk about what these three faith traditions have in common, stemming from the Abrahamic roots. It's been criticized by some people as being in danger of forming on the world religions larger map, a little bit, a somewhat tighter club, the Abrahamic club, whereas there are a lot of Hindus, there are a lot of Buddhists in the world, there are other people there who don't belong to this club, is this effort to find this common ground among the Abrahamic traditions. Does it carry with it a certain divisive danger with reference to other faiths that don't have that? Now, I've talked to Muslim scholars, I want to get to this in a moment, who are exploring at least the idea that the old and very ancient and very central Muslim idea of the people of the book, which includes Jews and Christians in Muslim theology, might be extended, in fact, to include people of the book whose book is a different one, like the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas. Their books too, their holy books, sacred books. This is a perfectly discussable topic now in some Muslim theological and scholarly circles. What do we mean by people of the book? Interesting question. But it also raises the question, what about those religions that don't have a book? Like African traditional religions, or some of the traditional religions of China. You can see that my interest in world religions and in interfaith dialogue has led me into some of these areas that you might not have thought about that often. But still, I think it's a good reminder to me, since I'm so interested in the Christian-Muslim facet of this larger conversation, that I sometimes forget there are other players who have to be taken into consideration as well. There are at present, according to most demographers, about 2 billion, 100 or 200 million, 2 billion Christians in the whole world, of whom about 1 billion are Roman Catholics, and the other billion, give or take, a million or so, are Protestants and Orthodox, and increasing Pentecostals. I have to think about the fact frequently, since I wrote a book a few years ago about Pentecostalism, that Pentecostalism, the Pentecostal variant of Christianity, is the fastest growing part of the whole Christian world. And growing especially in those parts of the world where Christianity is living cheek by jowl with other religions, including Islam, and this is especially the case in Africa. The explosive growth of Pentecostal Christianity in Africa, a continent which also has a major presence of Muslims, is something that we all have to watch, and watch very carefully, I think, in the months, years, decades to come. Now, I want to close off here, if I can, with just recounting a little bit from my own experience, and one experience in particular. I have been in the last 6 months, I've been in Egypt, I've been in Jordan, and also in Istanbul, Turkey. In each instance, engaged in very, very interesting and marvelous, memorable conversations with Muslim scholars who, in my experience of them, are deeply eager to enlarge and deepen their opportunities for conversation with Christian scholars from anywhere in the world, in their own regions or in other places. I find this very encouraging indeed. And I wish there were more of it going on. And I wanted to mention one, a lot of issues come up. Let me mention just two of them. One of them that always comes up, of course, is what do Christians think about this idea of a promised land? A promised land by whom and to whom? Of course, they're talking about Palestine and about the occupation of Palestine, or by large parts of it by Israel. What do you mean that God promised this land to them? How does that figure into the political configuration that we have to deal with in securing a just and durable peace in the Middle East. They're very interested. Why should they be interested in that? I've just told Professor Norton that there was an important conference held in Lebanon of Christian theologians from all around the world, some Jewish observers who were present, and some Muslims who were there, to talk about this vexed question of promised land. Who promised what to whom? What was the land that was promised? Under what conditions was it promised? What are we talking about here? And if you think this is really just a kind of how many angels dance on the point of the pin, it isn't. Because it's very central to get through this awful morass that has kept us from finding a peaceful way out of the Middle Eastern impasse. And I think we have to face it and think about it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to that conference, even though I wrote a paper for it, for various reasons that I won't go into now. But I have the report from that conference, and I know that the conversation will continue. Now, just one other insight into what comes up with these conversations. Some of it's a little funny. Some of it, I think, very telling. A woman scholar at the Institute for Advanced Islamic Studies in Istanbul, where I met with a group, had just come back from Europe, and she was very seriously committed to devoting her career, her scholarly career, to encouraging intellectual and theological exchange between Muslims and Christians. She really wanted to do that. That was going to be her life work. And she said to me, she asked a question. We were all sitting around a big table. She said, would you explain to me, please, one more time, what is this difference? What is the difference between homoousia and homoiousia in the early Christian creeds? What is that? Please tell me what that's about. She felt embarrassed when she came in. I said, please don't be embarrassed. Most Christians have no clue about what that means. One substance with the Father, or like substance with the Father. All this language that Christianity adopted, or Western Christianity adopted, when it moved from an Aramaic-speaking and Hebrew area into the Hellenistic world, and adapted itself and really, in some ways, subsumed itself under these kinds of theological categories. So I tried to explain to her. But she said, what we need are more programs in which people who are interested in Christian-Muslim dialogue can come here and talk with us, and we can go over and have conversations with you. We have to build this up because it's very minimal in most Muslim countries. There's a hunger for it, an interest in it. I had lunch with the Vatican ambassador, it's called the Nuncio, in Cairo, a specialist in Muslim-Christian dialogue who's there. He lives in Cairo. He represents the Holy See there. I asked him, what's happening here in Egypt in Christian-Muslim dialogue? He said, not much. There isn't much interest here in local Christians, Coptic Christians. Very little interest by the Catholics, and not much interest among the Muslims, except for the scholars. And even they don't have very much opportunity. So here's where we stand. I'm convinced that the biggest obstacle to this ongoing conversation is not a theological or religious obstacle. I think these are things we can talk about. We do talk about them. We'll, of course, disagree on certain things. We'll agree on some other things. But the experience of the Christian ecumenical movement of the 19th and early 20th century, with groups who were at odds with each other, finding common ground and coming together, even forming something like the World Council of Churches, and the vast change that took place in the Catholic Church during the Second Vatican Council, when there was official Catholic recognition of the validity of other paths to God. These changes can occur, and conversations can, that model is not a bad one. An expanded ecumenical movement model is not a bad one, but it is so undermined and so threatened by, if I may be blunt, by the war on terror, which undermines so much of what we try constructively to do, because it's anything we try to do, either Muslims who try to be in conversation with us, or those of us who try to be in conversation with Muslims in the Middle East, have to face the fact that this whole enterprise is viewed with very deep suspicion, and by some people as a kind of disguised new edition of that old crusading mentality, which is another exhumable stereotype which gets pulled out a lot. So now I'm looking forward to your comments on this, and I apologize to Marianne if you've heard all this before. Did I add anything new today? Oh, I did. Because that course was a year and a half ago. Thinking since then. So thank you all for listening, and Bob, if you can come up.
Thank you very much. We've had really had some very hopeful comments and some inspiring comments from Professor Collins. And now we have a chance to see whether or not there is resonance from the perspective of an anthropologist who focuses on the Muslim world, and especially on Southeast Asia. There is resonance for the sort of dialogue that Professor Cox was talking about, and where that dialogue might go. Professor Hefner, as you know, is from the Department of Anthropology. I noticed that I looked over here to the bookshelf. One of his books, Civil Islam, is here on the shelf. A book that a lot of people have found very helpful for understanding Islam in Indonesia during a recent period of time. So Bob Hefner, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Professor Cox, for what was, as always, a very stimulating and original presentation. I'll begin by saying I don't have a lot to add here. I think I agree so strongly with almost all that you said, that really all I have are additional observations and maybe a slightly different perspective on some things, just because of a different history of engagement in a different type of dialogue, which brings me to my first point. I think Professor Norton will vouch for this, that the efforts of dialogue and mutual understanding across civilizations and across religious traditions and across national traditions, the effort was well underway back in the late 1980s, but especially in the 1990s. I'm talking, of course, about what you began with, which is Professor Cox, with the contemporary crisis. But the sense of crisis and the sense of a need to address issues in a new way actually had reached a kind of crescendo by the mid-1990s, influenced in this instance by, of course, Professor Cox, your colleague over at Harvard, and then my colleague for a year and a half. I sat with him around the table for a year and a half at his invitation. I'm referring to Sam Huntington, of course, the author of an article in a book entitled The Clash of Civilizations with a question mark. Both from the mid-90s, both set off, they actually both reflected discussions that were already underway, and they set off a storm of controversy, both in the public and in State Department and governmental circles and non-governmental circles here in the United States. And the reason I mention this is that by the end of the 1990s, this is, I think, not sufficiently appreciated. This is really to agree with what you're saying, Professor Cox, but to add a kind of additional kind of historical fact. By the end of the 1990s, many of us, Professor Norton may have a slightly different take on things, but many of us felt that, at least in the public media, as well as in the State Department, and I think, like Richard, I was involved in these discussions with State Department officials, sometimes 6, 7 times a year, going down and talking about the clash of civilizations. And what had happened is, in effect, the reaction of the Muslim world, which understandably enough was one of great anxiety and worry, a sense that the United States had identified a new successor to this communist rivalry that had preoccupied American administrations and many other Western administrations for the better part of a half-century. That the United States had finally settled on Muslims as the new post-Cold War enemy. And that Sam Huntington, who was of course recognized as an influential teacher to many State Department officials, was in fact the exponent of that view. But what the historical note that I'm suggesting is that in both media, in the State Department, and also I might add in the Catholic Church, with which I had some conversations during this time, there was in the mid-90s a kind of remarkable surge of elite-mediated or institutionally mediated as opposed to grassroots dialogue between scholars, both religious scholars, government officials, and then of course scholars of a non-religious sort, but who have some expertise in different religious traditions. And I think many of us, I certainly had the impression that Sam Huntington had lost. I was told that in State Department circles. I was told that by the ambassador to Indonesia, who had also served in the Balkans. He said Sam Huntington fortunately lost the debate in State Department circles. So, and I think there was evidence that in the Catholic Church, among some Catholic intellectuals, and in some media, great progress had been made, but I don't think it's much too easy, of course, to talk about winning and losing. But there was a sense of confidence that, in fact, things were improving, and that there was heightened interest and respect, heightened interest in and respect for, heightened interest in Islam and respect for Muslims, and that we were on the cusp of a kind of new age. I can remember coming out of my religion and politics course, which I was teaching above the old Guitar Center on Cobb Ave. Some of you have been here a few years and perhaps you recall. On September 11th, 2001, and somebody came up to me, a colleague, an academic college professor, came up and said, "Have you heard the news?" And I said, "What?" It's 11 o'clock. My class had just gotten up 9:30 to 11. He said, "There was an attack in New York City, and there's probably going to be an attack in Boston." The rumors were quite wild at that time. And I remember thinking to myself, first of all, I said a brief prayer. I am a religious person. For the victims. And then I thought to myself with great sadness, having been involved in the kind of things that Richard Norton has as well for the better part of that decade, that this is going to change everything. That this is going to result in serious setbacks. And it has. I think it has. What 9/11 did was not merely sort of cause an awful loss of life and bring attention to what is really a very, very small but well-organized and dedicated group of militants at the fringe of Muslim politics. But it set in motion a process of massification, if you will, if I can use that term. A massification of very complex religious and political issues. And by massification, I mean the ideas were no longer those of contained dialogue, and I don't say that disrespectfully. Contained dialogue was very, very constructive. That was what mostly was taking place in the 90s. That is, there were circles of scholars like those you described, Professor Cox, and it still takes place. Circles of scholars meeting, sharing ideas, learning more about each other, and finding in their both commonality and their differences hope. Finding above all some measure of understanding and enjoyment and mutual appreciation. And when you move interreligious differences, when you massify them and politicize them and militarize them, as the 9/11 attackers did, and did quite deliberately. I knew several of the Bali bombers in Indonesia, who were the 1 year later group. It was a remarkable coincidence. I had visited their pesantren. And they too did a similar thing, and they did so deliberately, and they were aware of what they were doing, that when you move dialogue beyond those contained, well-contained, rightfully elite, elitism is often decried, well, this was a rightfully elite circle. So you open up the process to a kind of politicization that introduces an entirely different dynamic, and that's what we're heir to today. And so what I'm saying, Professor Cox, is I applaud. It's just wonderful, both the spirit and the substance of your presentation. But I'm not more pessimistic, but I'm more sobered, having been like you, but on a much smaller scale and in a much smaller role, having been involved in that dialogue since the 1990s. I'm sobered by the scale of the political challenge. I'm sobered by the way in which the movement of discussion out of those well-contained, mutually self-interested and mutually appreciative circles introduces dynamics such as those that we've seen in recent years in the United States. I will want to just add another little fact here that will perhaps complexify just a bit. I agree with you about the negative impact of the war on terror. I was doing a State Department trip in Indonesia, scheduled way in advance, and it just happened to coincide with 1 week after the invasion of Iraq. It was a State Department trip to go around to Islamic universities to talk about some utterly dry, mundane things, Islamic education. Well, needless to say, nobody wanted to hear my views on Islamic education and contemporary Muslim reforms and the relations with an earlier Christian educational tradition. They wanted to talk about Iraq, and they were angry. They saw this as a betrayal, and they saw me as a representative of a government that had made these were people mostly of democratic Muslim persuasion, saw this as a betrayal of an outreach that had been sustained, and it had been sustained since the early 1990s, and if you will, a showing of the hands that revealed that what the United States was really about was imperial domination. I think it actually was much more complex than that. I'm not a Chomskyan. But the massification, the politicization, the militarization of religious difference introduces a dynamic massively different than what we saw in the 90s, where there are already incidents of violence and mutual recrimination on all sides, many sides, local and international context. And that's what we face. And that's why I'm not dissenting at all, Professor Cox, from your entirely accurate and compelling portrayal. But what I am suggesting is that the dialogues that have to be conducted now are dialogues in quotes. They're going to be dialogues that really will require much more sustained intervention, our intervention in the media, much more sustained and scaling up of initiatives on the part of governments and non-governmental organizations, and a really deliberate and unending effort to prevent things like that which we see most right now in the United States with, again, politicization and massification of issues whereby some people, and I mean on all sides, it's not just two sides, of course, it's all sides, seeing political advantage in portraying religious difference as, in some sense, irrecuperable, in some sense, the Muslim minority in America as indigestible, so to speak. We have reached an ironic point of transition, I end here, where whatever one thinks of President Bush's war on terror, I'm not defending that at all, but where his words, which from the beginning after 9/11, correctly pointed out that this is not a war on Islam. Now some of his actions, his comments, sent a mixed message, to put it mildly. But at the very least, his words within his party circles had an impact, and they created a climate within intellectual circles and think tanks associated with the Republican Party that I will say were salutary, at least to some degree. And what we've seen is an erosion of that. The problem then is much, much larger. It's a problem that requires our intervention through universities, through the media, and once again, not merely, but also with small-scale dialogue. We need those large-scale efforts of outreach and a repositioning and reorientation of our government and our people's understanding of the Muslim world and engagement with it. That said, since I've struck a rather pessimistic note, I'm not pessimistic at all. I think the objective circumstances in most of the Muslim world are so far ahead of where most of us, most of the US media, and to a certain degree some in government circles, it's so far ahead and so positive. I think the future is bright. I look to Turkey, I see, yes, a very complex situation, but an extraordinarily positive model. Complex model, admittedly, but positive model for the Muslim world. I look to Indonesia, where I've worked for 35 years, and I see the demonstration, once again, of democracy, a complex democracy, a flawed democracy as regarded the Ahmadiyya minority for those. But I look to Bangladesh, I look to Mali, I look to Senegal, and everywhere one looks, there are examples of extraordinary political progress. Finally, I look to the educational transformation that's sweeping the Muslim world. 60% of college students in Egypt, 62% in the Sudan, 58 to 62%, the statistics vary, of students in Malaysia in higher education are women. And that's a complex thing. Many of them are very pious women. Some of them are theologically, religiously conservative. But they're women, they're participating much more proactively in public life than they have historically. So part of the message that I'm saying we have to scale up is not just that we share much in common as Abrahamic believers and or people of the book in this broad sense of the term, but that the Muslim world itself is ahead of our perceptions, and actually, notwithstanding the awful violence on the fringe, this is, ironically, a time of great hope, and it's time for us, I think, to say that. Thank you.
Well, appropriately so with those remarks. I'm not going to add my own comment at this point. I will be a chance to do that before we wrap up. But I do want to open the floor to your comments and questions. And who would like to begin? Yes, sir.
Professor Cox referred to people in the book as being sort of a Latter-day concept. I was under the impression that the early Muslims thought of themselves that way. Is that not so?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, from the beginning, Muslims have thought of themselves as people of the book, and as Christians, and of Christians and Jews, as also people of the book. And my reference to something more recent is the expansion or deepening of that notion of who are the people of the book, and whether the book could include some of the other sacred scriptures of other traditions. I just say one word to Professor Hefner. I couldn't agree more that we have to combine the intellectually informed conversations with a lot more going on at the grassroots. I didn't talk about that here, but I'm also encouraged by that in various parts of the world, that people who are not professional theologians or scholars are engaged in this conversation. I do a lot of speaking at interfaith associations in the United States. Almost every community has them. And I'm always impressed when I get there to see what an active role the local Muslim community in San Francisco or Dallas or Detroit is taking. And these are conversations among very, very ordinary people who are trying to learn about each other and from each other. We need a lot more of that. Could I add also that I was in the Vatican on my way home this past a few months ago. I gave a lecture at the Pontifical Gregorian University, which is the elite university in Rome, and they told me they have appointed now the first fully tenured permanent Muslim professor at the Pontifical University, Jesuit University in Rome. That's not a temporary chair. That's going to be there for a while. Because they foresee this as one of the major theological and religious frontiers that they have to participate in and learn about.
I know the talk is about Muslims in the eyes of the Christians, but after 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, how do you see the minority Christians are affected with this? they've lived decades, if not centuries, with fellow Muslim communities peacefully. I'm sure there was violence, but not as much now. But how do you see it affecting now, especially in Egypt, Coptic minorities?
Of course, not just in the Middle East, in many Muslim countries we see significant Christian minorities. Egypt is, of course, one example. Would either of you like to tackle that? Bob, perhaps you'd like to?
Well, it's bad for everybody. It's certainly bad for Christian minorities in those countries. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt from my own experience that the polarization, and I must say the polemization of Christian-Muslim differences has resonated very deeply in places like Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt. And what I do find different in those countries is that people are taking, I think, a much more serious approach to engaging in ecumenical dialogue. And unfortunately, in my view, what I think we see here in this country is a lot of people who are opportunistically, on the political front, who are opportunistically exploiting the polarization rather than trying to bridge it. And I think that's quite sad. And when we look at some of the respectable political personalities who are engaging in this, reportedly respectable, it's really quite distressing. Yes, sir. Yeah, yes.
I was just going to say, is President Obama's inauguration into office in this time for the past several years, has that enhanced any type of dialogue? Obviously seemed like he was embraced more so by Muslim countries, but has that added to any type of dialogue or helped increase it?
Well, I might take the privilege of standing here at the podium to say something about that, if I may. Of course, President Obama has made two very significant public speeches on this issue. One in Ankara, speaking to the Turkish Parliament, and then perhaps more famously in Cairo at the American University in Cairo. And right now I know that his advisors are looking for another venue to sort of continue the message and to continue the debate. But I also know from recent meetings in the White House that there's a lot of distress with the trends. The trends are not running in a good direction. When people look at polling data, when they look at attitudes of Muslims towards Christian societies, when they look at attitudes within Christian societies towards Muslims, they're not reassured that call for dialogue is actually moving in a productive direction. So there's a lot of concern about it, and I think we all should be concerned. I thought that Bob Hefner's comments, sobering comments, were entirely appropriate in that regard. Yes, ma'am.
You'll talk about how 9/11 and the war on terror has led to this massification of dialogue and conversation in interfaith circles, and how this has kind of led to more negative relationships in on the whole society. And I was wondering if the reason for some of these increased tensions after the massification of dialogue started is because there wasn't already a massification of dialogue before these things happened. These religious conversations were contained more circles.
And they just became louder afterwards. Is that right? Would you like to address that, Professor Cox?
What do you think?
By massification, I meant the kind of mass instrumentalization of religious issues for interests that are not necessarily themselves religious. Indeed, from a religious perspective, they have just the opposite intent. But what happens in a time of crisis like that, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, was that this the popular attention, needless to say, in the Muslim world is focused on these conflicts. And the idea that there is a clash of civilizations, which I might say was always welcomed in radical Islamist circles. Not in Muslim circles, of course, but in radical Islamist circles. They had some radical Islamists from Morocco to Algeria to Indonesia had been playing up that there is a clash of civilizations and that the United States was looking for an enemy. But of course, with the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the, if you will, publicization of the plight of ordinary people, Muslim people, in these lands, the theme now captured the popular imagination, or at least a segment of the popular imagination. So if there were dialogues taking place before, but the very skillful manipulation of what was, after all, a real conflict of interest. It's not as if it's not as if these were not issues about which people could legitimately disagree. But the skillful manipulation of that for the purposes of, if you will, recruiting support for what were typically entirely different domestic agendas, and I might add, agendas that most typically had to do with efforts to marginalize and contain what is really the dominant current in most, not all, but most of the Muslim world, which was an interest in political reform along democratic lines. And if you will to contain that and say people who were promoting democratization in Muslim lands or promoting westernization, and we see now what Western interests are, all of these things created an atmosphere in which what had once been a very marginal message suddenly loomed large, and it did have a negative impact. But again, let me emphasize, its impact has been, its practical impact has been surprisingly contained. Let me speak like a sociologist, not like an anthropologist or like a political scientist. We now have 15 years of polling data from about, between, depending on the poll, 15 to 30 Muslim majority countries. And what's striking is that the U.S. intervention and the conflict in the aftermath of 9/11 has not significantly dampened Muslim public support, which is the majority in all but a handful of countries, Libya, Saudi Arabia, a few of the Gulf states, has not significantly eroded that public interest and support for democracy. People say, oh, well, that's just majoritarianism. It isn't. The studies, the surveys, the follow-up, more in-depth studies show that the dominant current in the Muslim world remains this vibrant interest in a more open, responsive, and in effect, not just in effect, and literally, democratic system. So, yeah, there's much more going on than just the crimping of dialogue, but there is at the same time, I'm trying to say, there's extraordinary hope, and indeed the basic currents of social change, educational, political, shifts in political culture all across the Muslim world are extremely heartening. We have to get through this crisis caused by, if you will, the noise at the margins.
I'd like to take the privilege of the podium to ask Professor Collins a question. And I'll turn over the podium to you after I do. I didn't mention this in introducing you, but it's apt to mention that you played an important role in the civil rights movement. You were early in your inspirational comments. You were early in terms of your organizational activities. You were a friend and associate of Martin Luther King. You yourself demonstrated civil disobedience context and so on. And you participated in what was arguably the most important mass movement of the 20th century in America. I wonder if the emphasis on elite dialogue, on these questions which involve in significant ways ecumenicalism, I wonder if this misses the point. I wonder if we really need the dialogue at a different level. And in that regard, whether or not religious leaders in America and other members of the intellectual elite in America should be playing a more active role in encouraging the kind of dialogue and the sort of understanding that you would like to promote? And if so, do you have any practical ideas in terms of how to get that started?
Yeah, well, thank you for reminding me of that, because it does give us a very fascinating and informative model. A lot of the thinking that went into the civil rights movement, eventually went into it, was originally rather elite. These were books and pamphlets and sermons, and what happened in the 1960s was a remarkable mobilization of thousands, indeed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, largely but not exclusively from black churches, a lot of white churches, Catholic and Protestant churches and synagogues, who were enlisted in what I still think is the most significant social movement of the 20th century, a nonviolent movement. Now I know personally from having known Dr. King that he had read Gandhi. He was a very bookish fellow. Many people don't know that. And he would have preferred to be a theology professor. He once told me, thank God he didn't do that. He had found another calling. But he didn't know anything at all, he admitted, about how you actually organize large groups of people in nonviolent action and participation. And one of the early tasks we had in his organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was finding people who could do that, who could fan out, and people are not necessarily naturally nonviolent. They have to be trained, they have to have these workshops, they have to go through drills, they have to know what to do when somebody spits at you and calls you a name and throws rocks at you and sticks a dog on you. You have to know, and you have to know it very deeply. And I believe that part of what made that possible was the profound religious motivation that was present in the civil rights movement. It wasn't just a political movement with a religious beneath it. This was a deeply religious movement with political and social and other kinds of objectives, and reached into that kind of inner motivation that people had. But it had to be done on a massive scale. It had to be done organizationally. And this is what is lacking. I think we can agree with this. Whatever local interfaith organizations do, a lot of places I go, there are groups of Muslims from the local mosque meeting with people from the local churches, but it's still quite minimal in what we really need. And at the same time, this radical fringe of Muslim haters, let's use the word, is growing and has its voice growing. And we have people, let's name them, like Newt Gingrich, on the national scene, political leaders on the national scene, who see this as red meat that they can throw into the political arena and play with fire. To say nothing of the television commentators and others who see this and play it out in what I think is a very, very dangerous way. So in order to counter that, we need a much larger, more extensive, more vigorous, and I think also spiritually informed movement at the grassroots level that can balance the picture more. And I'm doing what I can, but I'm only one person. There are many people out there trying this, but boy, it is tough sledding, especially tough sledding given this change of sentiment that Professor Hefner's talked about, this jacking up of the vitriol on the other side. I don't think we're finished with that. I think that's going to continue or will have to be dealt with.
I wonder if you can, let me just keep you up there one more minute. Ask you if you reflect on your new book, Future of Faith. It's community-based, not so much on the structure of churches and doctrines and so on, but on shared faith. Whether that's a promising development for the kind of dialogue we're talking about, or one that's another complication.
Oh, I think it's promising. I think it's a promising development. That's another whole story. I insist people go out and buy my book rather than I summarize it. Do you have the paperback edition?
No, hardback.
The paperback edition is now out. It's cheaper than the hardback edition, but it has the same message in it. No, I see this as a very positive development. And I see it across the board. I don't think this is just a development in Christianity. A movement away on the part of a lot of people from thinking of religion as a set of beliefs that you subscribe to, into thinking of religion, faith, as the way you live your life, informed by tradition, informed by the values of that tradition, the saints and prophets and martyrs of that tradition, this is distinctly discernible, I think, more so in the Christian world, because the Christian world has been more defined over many centuries by these creedal packages, by this packaging. And I've noticed so many people in the last few years who tell me, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I said, what does that mean? I'm spiritual, but not religious. They haven't become atheists, but they are understandably suspicious of the packaging, institutional and doctrinal packaging of, in my case, the Christian message, the basic Christian message. They want to get at it without that kind of overlay that's come down with it. And I think this is true of Protestants and Catholics across the board. There's something sometimes called the turn toward experience. People want to experience something directly rather than having it handed down to them from an authority. There's that suspicion of authority that's there. And I think those who study the Muslim world could say some of that same thing is happening. I think the growth of Sufism, for example, within the Muslim community, and this yearning for democracy that you talk about, I think these are trends that go across the denominational and religious lines. I think it's very hopeful.
Good. That's a good note. I want to thank the Institute for Muslim Societies and Civilizations at Boston University for making this event possible. And I want to thank all of you for coming to the event. And most of all, I would like to thank my colleague, Robert Hefner, and especially Professor Harvey for making that journey across the river. I hope you didn't have to paddle it.
I walked on the water.
Well, no, that might be possible, actually. No, I want to thank you very much for a very stimulating session, for giving us lots to muse over and think about, and to remind us there's still much work to be done. Thank you very, very much.